One of my most challenging and, at times, most controversial lectures is the one in which I explain the theory of evolution by natural selection to students and audience members who identify as creationists or proponents of intelligent design. My aim in these moments is not conversion, nor the dismissal of deeply held beliefs, but clarity. Too often, disagreement arises not from the theory itself, but from distorted caricatures of what the theory actually claims. What I have found most effective is not beginning with points of conflict, but with points of agreement. When we start with observations about the natural world that virtually everyone accepts, variation within populations, heredity, limited resources, and differential survival, the conversation shifts from ideology to evidence. From there, we can work backward toward the broader theoretical framework, rather than presenting it as a finished doctrine to be accepted or rejected wholesale. To aid this process, I use the acronym FISITED as a pedagogical scaffold. While no acronym can capture the full complexity of a scientific theory, maps are always simpler than the terrain they represent. VISITED offers a clear, structured way to understand the core components of evolutionary reasoning. It allows skeptics and believers alike to see how the theory is built step by step, grounded in observable facts rather than philosophical assumptions. My hope is that this framework does not end debate, but elevates it. Education, at its best, is not a closed door of dogma, but an open window, one that invites careful thought, honest questions, and respectful disagreement. What follows is offered in that spirit, not as a final word, but as a starting point for deeper understanding and more productive dialogue.
I like to take risks since it makes the class more fun and engaging. Of course, because of this, one can end up with egg on one's face. It was a lazy Tuesday afternoon in October when my students invited a group of Christian fundamentalists to attend my lecture on evolution and how it can potentially explain hitherto inexplicable phenomena. I'm not quite sure why they attended class that day, but I don't think they expected to have their minds changed in the next hour. But that was the challenge I put forth. To think differently, I said, not really thinking through the consequences beforehand, that the majority of those new attendees, steeped as they were in the inerrancy of their holy book, would change their minds about evolution, and for the first time would realize why such a theory not only makes sense, but actually it makes too much sense. Indeed, Daniel Dennett, in his eminently readable book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Evolution and the Meaning of Life, argues that evolution by natural selection is a universal acid that cuts through each and every ism. Moreover, he believes that it is the greatest single idea ever propagated in the history of science. This is precisely because it provides an evidentially convincing explanation for the wide variances that we find in nature. The problem is that far too often the theory of evolution by natural selection is taught in a confusing manner that betrays its elegant simplicity. It was for this reason that T.H. Huxley lambasted himself for being too stupid not to have thought of the idea himself. Writes Huxley in the 1880s, "The origin provided us with the working hypothesis we sought. Moreover, it did the immense service of freeing us forever from the dilemma. Refuse to accept the creation hypothesis, and what have you to propose that can be accepted by any cautious reasoned?" In 1857 I had no answer ready, and I do not think that anyone else had. A year later we reproached ourselves with dullness for being perplexed with such an inquiry. My reflection, when I first made myself master of the central idea of that origin, was, how extremely stupid not to have thought of that. I suppose that Columbus's companions said much the same when he made the egg stand on end. We're blinded from the obviousness of evolution by natural selection because we only see genetic successes, not all of the life forms that never fructified. Nature is not so much a selector as an eliminator. In The Magic of Evolution, the short film likens evolution to a card trick where almost all of the conjurer's guesses are wrong. But what is remembered, what passes on, is the one time they were right. Evolution likewise is a record of what survived, not necessarily what didn't. However, if we dig deep enough, in dirt or in genes, we find traces of what came before. In a very literal sense, we are a record of the varying environments that our DNA had to engage with over time and in the midst of constant struggle. I mention this as a preface, since I knew that my skeptical audience wanted to know how and why evolutionary theory was superior to their long-held belief in biblical creationism. Thus, I thought it wise to start with a now famous acronym, VISITED, that was developed decades prior by biologists to explain the algorithmic process of how a pure materialist explanation could account for the apparent design that we see in nature. The key to explaining evolution, to those who resist the idea on religious grounds, is to systematically focus on what is agreed upon and then proceed step by step. I asked for one volunteer to serve as our human test case. Why do we look the way we do? The first answer that everyone agrees upon is that we are the result of our parents having sex. I then make the argument our father and our mother, metaphorically speaking, are books of information. When two books are recombined, as in sexual intercourse, the result is a new edition. Naturally, I apologize for the bad pun, so the question arises, what is the language that encodes these books of information? First, our book, what we call our genome, has 46 chapters or chromosomes. These in turn have roughly 20,000 to 25,000 pages or genes. Within these genes is a most remarkable alphabet known as deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, which forms a double helix. By the acronym CE tag, it is an easy way to understand the names of the four base pairs of DNA, cytosine, thymine, adenine, and guanine. Adenine couples with thymine and guanine with cytosine. From this elementary coding system, we get life's variety. There are two fundamental ways that as humans we achieve variation of V in nature: sexual selection and genetic mutation. The introduction of chance or occasional mutations into the genome is important because it causally explains how a child can indeed be unexpectedly and unpredictably different than his parents. What is not so apparent is how a four-lettered language could produce the wide array of complexity that we see in the human species. In other words, how can such diversity arise from only four varying molecule clusters? If we only had zeros and ones, we could, in point of fact, reproduce our entire alphabet and our entire English set of words, sentences, paragraphs, and books. Indeed, we could recapitulate any system of information that has appeared on Earth. The key in evolution is a relatively stable mechanism for inheritance, our I, which can have an inherent capacity for modification. This is why the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA was so groundbreaking, since it explained the secret of genetics. But even though sexual selection and genetic mutations can explain much, they are not sufficient to explain a much larger process called natural selection, for which Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace are rightly famous. Natural selection, though precisely defined by Darwin, has led to some unnecessary confusion, since it mistakenly implies a conscious act on the part of nature to pick and choose. Rather, it may be more properly understood as natural elimination. Anything that can survive this global and unending process is, because of such survival, sufficient, not necessarily best, to continue on. Viewed in this purview, evolution by natural selection isn't so much about fittest or strongest or best, but rather as contingently successful. With the operative word here being contingent, what is viable in one environmental niche may not be so in another. What cannot be denied are the vast odds against life to survive under such harried conditions. Natural selection, or natural elimination, or survival of the sufficient, however we describe this winnowing process, is fundamentally a description of how organic life struggles for a temporary respite from ultimate annihilation. We have realized three key factors which have determined why we look the way we do: sexual selection, genetic mutation, and natural selection. Play this out in your own life. Right now you are being tested by nature, even if completely unknowingly. If something survives, you know a priori it has been edited or pruned by the very competition which led to its survival. Knowing the conditions from where we originally arose is a central key to understanding why we survive as we do in the present. For evolution to work, it needs a period of time to work, and that we have an abundance, contrary to Lord Kelvin's original estimates, given that our planet is 4.5 billion years old and the universe over 13.5 billion years old. The algorithm of nature can be likened to a recipe where, if all the right ingredients are in place, it is possible to have life evolve from simple to more complex forms. If there is variation, V, inheritance, I, selection, S, and time, T, it leads to design, and D. Almost all fundamentalist Christians, who believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible, more or less accept evolution by natural selection within a range. What most of them object to in class is the idea that the human species evolved from some earlier primate species. At the molecular level, deoxyribonucleic acid isn't concerned with our macro issues of whether something is a defined species or not. At these tiny scales, it is merely a question of biochemistry. Thus, if you accept microevolution within a species, you have already de facto accepted evolution itself, since all DNA manipulation, which is how evolutionary change occurs over time in organic beings, is at the micro level. After I gave my lecture, I noticed a deep bewilderment on the faces of a number of Christian students. It was as if an impossibly complex puzzle that they thought was unsolvable by science was solved in a few simple steps. Indeed, therein lies the rub. The very idea that the design of the cosmos can occur without a designer seems counterintuitive. But that is precisely why Darwinian evolution is so radical. It provides a coherent and comprehensive explanation of how complexity arises from unconscious and simpler rules of physics and biology.
All right, we're going to dive into one of the biggest, most misunderstood ideas in all of science, evolution. But I want you to forget the dense textbooks and the confusing jargon for a minute. We're going to strip it all away and reveal a simple, powerful algorithm, a recipe, really, that explains the absolutely breathtaking diversity of life on Earth.
So picture this. Our story starts in a university classroom. A professor's teaching a course on science and religion, and he decides to take a massive risk. His class has just been joined by a group of Christian fundamentalists who are, deeply skeptical of evolution. And he decides to make a really bold claim right then and there.
He basically lays down a challenge, not to start a fight or to create a confrontation, but to offer a totally new way of thinking about it. He was gambling that if he could just present Darwin's idea with its original elegant simplicity, he could show them why the theory doesn't just make sense, but why it actually makes too much sense to just ignore.
And that professor's challenge really gets to the heart of the matter, right? Why is this idea so often so hard to grasp? Well, here's the secret. The problem isn't that evolution is impossibly complex. It's that the way it's often taught just buries its simple beauty under layers and layers of jargon and misunderstanding. This quote from T.H. Huxley, who was one of Darwin's biggest supporters, it just says it all. When he finally got the central idea, his reaction wasn't, "Wow, this is so complicated." It was, "How could I have been so stupid not to have thought of that myself?" It's like that old trick of making an egg stand on its end. Once you see how it's done, it's just perfectly blindingly obvious.
The philosopher Daniel Dennett takes it even further. He calls evolution the single greatest idea in all of history. Why? He says it's like a universal acid, a powerful material explanation for design and variety that just cuts through all our preconceived notions and gives us a solid, evidence-based way to understand the living world.
Okay, so here's a huge source of the confusion. The term natural selection. It makes it sound like Mother Nature is some conscious being, sitting there actively picking winners and losers. A much, much better way to think about it is natural elimination. Nature isn't selecting for success. It's just automatically eliminating whatever fails to work in a specific environment. And this leads to something called survivor bias. See, we only see the winners. We look around at all these incredible, amazing, successful life forms, and we're totally blinded by them. We don't see the billions upon billions of different variations that were eliminated along the way because they just weren't sufficient to survive. Evolution is really the story of what made it, not all the things that did. So, how does this simple process of elimination create such incredible complexity? Well, it all comes down to a simple, four-part recipe. An algorithm that, when you let it run for a very long time, can produce all the apparent design we see in nature without ever needing a designer. And here it is, the 4 ingredients: variation, inheritance, selection, and time. You can remember it with the acronym VIST. That's it. Seriously, that's the whole shebang. These 4 elements are all you need for evolution to do its thing. So, let's break them down, one by one.
First up, variation. This is the raw material. You can't have elimination if everything is exactly the same, right? This variation comes from 2 main places: sexual reproduction, which is like shuffling 2 decks of genetic cards to create new hands, and random genetic mutations, which are like wildcards that introduce totally new, unpredictable traits into the mix.
Next, you need inheritance. For any of those traits, good, bad, or indifferent, to matter, they have to be passed down from one generation to the next. This happens through our genes. So think of your entire genome as a book. That book has 46 chapters. Those are your chromosomes. And each chapter is filled with about 25,000 pages. Those are your genes. And what are those pages written in? A surprisingly simple four-letter alphabet: A, T, C, and G. These are the DNA base pairs. And here's a really elegant part. Adenine always pairs with thymine, and guanine always pairs with cytosine. That's the rule. This simple code is the language for all of life's incredible complexity. It's like how binaries, ones and zeros, can write any computer program. This four-letter code can write any living organism.
Our third ingredient is selection, or as we've been calling it, elimination. And this is why we really need to replace that old phrase, survival of the fittest. It's not about being the absolute strongest or the fastest or the best. It's about being sufficient to survive and reproduce in a very specific, constantly changing environment. What works perfectly in the desert would be a complete disaster in the Arctic. It's all relative.
And now for the final, and maybe the most mind-bending ingredient of all: time. A truly incomprehensible amount of it. This simple algorithm of variation, inheritance, and selection has had 4.5 billion years to run on planet Earth. That fast timescale is the secret sauce. It's what allows these simple rules to produce such magnificent and complex results. So we've got our four ingredients. We've got variation, inheritance, selection, and a whole lot of time. Now let's see how they combine to create the breathtaking design we see in everything from a butterfly's wing to the human eye.
Here it is, the grand equation. When you have variation being passed down through inheritance, which is then acted upon by selection over vast amounts of time, the inevitable result is what looks like purposeful design. It's a cumulative process where tiny successful changes just build on each other over millions and millions of years.
Now, this is where we can bridge the gap for a lot of people who might be skeptical. Most people have absolutely no problem accepting microevolution. These are the small changes we can literally see happening. Dogs being bred for different traits or bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics. It's just evolution happening within a single species. So what then is macroevolution? The emergence of entirely new species. It is not a different process. It is the exact same process as microevolution, but with that fourth ingredient, time, added in massive quantities. It's the compounding interest of tiny little changes over millions and millions of years.
And that's the absolute key. If you accept that small inherited changes can happen within a species, and we see this stuff all the time, then you've already accepted the fundamental engine for all of evolution. The only thing separating a tiny change in a moth's color from the evolution of a brand new species is time. That's it.
Which brings us right back to our professor and his skeptical students. What happened after he laid out this simple four-part recipe for them? The students didn't get angry, they didn't get argumentative. Instead, their faces just showed this look of deep bewilderment. It was the look of an aha moment. As if a puzzle they'd always been told was unsolvable was suddenly laid bare, solved by just a few simple, logical steps. The sheer elegance of the explanation had just cut through all the confusion.
And this really gets to the heart of why this idea is so powerful and for some, so troubling. It's completely counterintuitive. We humans are pattern-seeking animals. When we see intricate design, our brains immediately assume there must have been a designer. Darwin's radical, brilliant idea was to provide a coherent, comprehensive explanation for how all this complexity can arise from simple, unconscious rules.
So, I'll leave you with this thought. If a simple, four-step algorithm can explain the entire, magnificent diversity of life on Earth, what does that say about other complex systems we struggle to understand? What other seemingly impossible puzzles in our world might just be waiting for us to find their own simple, elegant recipe?